Before we head to this week's Sports Corner, we have the Bronx Team and Player of the Week. Congratulations are in order. How about the Lehman Lightning men's basketball team? 8 players from the BX on the roster, including standout freshman Jalen King, shown here with the highlight reel jam. The Lightning, a pristine 20-3 record coming into the semifinals of the CUNYACs Wednesday after downing Brooklyn in the quarterfinals. Conference championship is tonight. Shout out to Lehman and King for dazzling the BX. To the Sports Corner we go. I think what's great too about the book, obviously you're such a terrific writer yourself, but you also got a chance to work with ESPN analyst Keyshawn Johnson. What was that like?
Oh man, he is a pain in the neck editor. I got to tell you, that guy, Keyshawn is awesome. He has been awesome in this whole process. Now, I've heard nightmares about these collaboration agreements with writers. So, I had to be careful, but Keyshawn and I have known each other for more than 25 years. I covered him when he was started with the Jets. And there is obviously a trust factor there on his end. And when I approached him about the idea of collaborating with him on this book and told him the backdrop to it, told him that he grew up 5 miles from where Kenny Washington starred as a high school football player and then a college player, and he knew nothing about them and Woody Strode, he was pretty intrigued. He goes, and the fact that they played with Jackie Robinson at UCLA and are not given the same kind of credit for integrating their sport as Jackie Robinson is obviously for baseball. So it was a collaboration that really hit instantly. And it's been great ever since. I love Keyshawn. I love working with him, and he's been fabulous.
And Bob, that's really a terrific segue here because in baseball, we have Jackie Robinson Day. We celebrate 42. How come the NFL hasn't honored their pioneers? What is your opinion on that?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think the NFL is moving along toward recognizing just how important these 4 men are. They will be honored at the Super Bowl. And I think that really is a big step forward. The NFL has invited the families of the 4 players, all of whom are long deceased, to be honored before the game. So to have the game in Los Angeles, to have these men whose legacies will be honored, I think is a real step in the right direction. Obviously more can always be done. An annual celebration, that would be great. I don't know if they do it. I don't know how they would do it, but sure. And the irony here is that in baseball, Jackie Robinson is rightly recognized for his great life, his meaningful life, and breaking the color barrier at a very difficult time. These guys have been forgotten in the NFL, and they really need to be, a light needs to be shined on them. The NFL is 70% African American. I think in baseball, there are fewer than 10% of the league's players are black. So it's just kind of like, well, they're honoring Jackie Robinson, which is correct, but they're not really doing the same for these 4 when the league is 3/4 African American. So, Keyshawn and I are really happy to be shining a light on the legacies of these men because they really shouldn't be forgotten, and hopefully they won't be.
And you mentioned Washington before, Bob. I mean, in 1939, arguably the best college player in the country, probably would have been the number 1 pick, but the league does not see that first black NFL draft pick until 10 years later, 1949.
Yeah, that's correct. And Kenny Washington signed basically as a free agent. So yes, I mean, it took a long time. And even when Washington Strode, Willis and Motley broke the color barrier, it wasn't like, the floodgates open. Okay, we should have black players in the NFL. They should be drafted, and we need to be fully integrated. It took a long time to be fully integrated, and it took really the AFL and owners like Lamar Hunt of Kansas City, forward-thinking people, the Rooneys eventually. Bill Nunn worked for the Rooneys after advocating for a lot of these players as a newspaper columnist. So it took some time, but there's only 1 first, and this time there are 4 firsts. So it's a little bit unusual, but these were the guys who really paved the way for players to come after them.
And there's an interesting story in the book with George Preston Marshall that brings the storyline really forward. We talk about, to present time with Juneteenth and George Floyd. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, after the George Floyd murder in 2020, there was obviously convulsive demonstrations nationwide, worldwide. And as part of that, in Washington, the statue of George Preston Marshall, which had stood outside RFK Stadium, was removed. And it was removed on Juneteenth. And it was a purposeful day that Juneteenth, the day that slavery ends, is the day that George Preston Marshall's monument is removed from RFK Stadium. And I think it drew attention. I think Washington fans now and football fans now, they don't, who's George Preston Marshall? Oh, I never heard of him. Oh, yeah, there might be a statue of the guy. Well, what he represented was, the worst of the worst. And Deacon Jones played for Washington late in his career. And he every time he walked by that monument, he spit at it because he knew what it represented. And, when you have that kind of anger, and a lot of Black fans in Washington, older fans, are Dallas Cowboys fans because they knew that George Preston Marshall wouldn't integrate his team. They hated him for that. And the Cowboys played Black players and they became Cowboys fans. So you go to any Washington game against Dallas in Washington, you're going to get a lot of Cowboys fans from the DC area. So that particular event after the George Floyd killing really resonated with this story. And that's why this story is we're not just telling a history of 1946. I think you probably lose some people, but if you kind of relate 1946 to 2021 and 22, you realize, wow, that there is an arc of history here that still continues.
Absolutely. And you mentioned it too earlier, Bob, about having this exclusive interview for the book with Roger Goodell. What was your biggest takeaway there?
My biggest takeaway was his kind of candor in admitting that the league has not really been up to snuff and has really been slow to kind of adjust. They have adjusted and they continue to adjust. It's not perfect. And I found that his personal experience with what his father went through related to what he eventually did in terms of coming out with a video after Black players in the NFL following George Floyd's killing said, Roger Goodell, you say it, Black Lives Matter. And he did that almost instantly because he thought back to his father and he knew that he was going to risk alienating a really big portion of his fan base, including President Trump, by saying that. But his father, way back in the day, risked his own political career by coming out against the Vietnam War. He was a Republican senator from New York. And he sat his family down, including Goodell, and said, listen, my political career is probably going to end when I come out in favor, against the Vietnam War, but I have to do what's right. And that really resonated with Roger Goodell. And he reflected back on that experience from his childhood when he was thinking about what he was going to do about making that video and kind of becoming more enlightened. And I think he has become more enlightened. The Colin Kaepernick situation is going to stay there, and it's not a good look for the NFL. It's just not. But I think he, moving forward, has been much more outspoken, and he wants to do right by adding diversity to the league in a meaningful way. Hasn't happened, but he is at the forefront of at least trying and pushing the owners to have a better record on diversity hiring.
Oh, it's a fascinating read, Bob. I think America's most popular sport, very much like America itself, is still trying to figure out things, even in 2022.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Bob. Congrats on another book. You can pick up Forgotten First online and also at all major retailers. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Bob.